Okay, and Dao, are we online? Are we live? Are we live?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you so much, and good evening to all, and good morning to the people that are watching us in the US. So I would like to thank each one of you for joining this conference that is dedicated to the subject of content policy. I bid, of course, a very warm welcome to all the speakers who agreed to join us tonight. We have the great privilege of organizing this event jointly with the Stanford Content Policy and Society Lab, directed by Julie Owono, who is with us tonight. And it's also an honor to have Professor Nathaniel Persily with us tonight. But we are pretty delighted that the director of Sciences Po, Mathias Vicherat, agreed to say a few words of introduction. So with no further ado, I give the floor to Mathias Vicherat. I think, Rachel, that you can stop the sharing of the slides. Thank you very much. So I give the floor to Director Vicherat.
Thank you very much, Florence. Thank you for this fruitful dialogue. And I think this is the beginning of something, I hope so. As you know, the deployment of the internet has led to an incredible democratization of access to information and knowledge. It has offered new opportunities to individuals who can meet online to exchange, cooperate, debate, or carry out transactions. But in the same time, these fantastic opportunities have also been linked to proliferation of fake news, conspiracy theories, and hate speech. Individuals are influenced through algorithms favoring engagement, which often promote the most toxic content. This is the reason why for several years now, Sciences Po researchers from many disciplines have been conducting research on these developments. In a way, the added value of Sciences Po has to do with assessing, studying the legal, economic, social consequences of the digital world enlargement. And especially the Media Lab studies in depth the mechanism by which content is generated, disseminated, and moderated on platforms, and the impact that online content may have on society. The Digital Governance and Sovereignty Share has published several studies considering these issues from the point of view of social science, political science, and law. All this research is conducted in the hope that technology may develop the common good, and the idea that it is also at the heart of Sciences Po. And for instance, we have a new partnership with McClatchy Institute to study how we could, let's say, imagine to have more democracy in the digital world, how we could promote a kind of democratization of the digital world. And in that way, we will recruit researchers on that very specific topic, thanks to the McClatchy partnership. And we will promote also some different projects on that very important topic. This is one of my top priorities, including ecological transition, what we could name digital transition is one of my two priorities. Then this is really a pleasure for me to introduce this dialogue on this topic with the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, and especially with the Content Policy and Society Lab. It is indeed absolutely crucial to have both sides of the Atlantic with America and France, because we face same issues, same challenges, and especially when it comes to policymakers that are currently working on the adoption of new regulations to impose more transparency on platforms. Then I hope, again, this is what I told you at the beginning, that this is the beginning of something between Stanford and Sciences Po, and you can count on the Sciences Po teams to develop such programs, such studies. And to conclude, I would like, obviously, to thank our partners, Soprasteria and Caisse des Dépôts, for making the work of the chair possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. My name is Rachel. I'm a research assistant at the Digital Governance and Sovereignty Chair, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I think that it will be a really interesting and insightful debate, and I want to thank again all of our speakers for being here today to share their expertise. So to briefly introduce everyone, we will first be hearing from Julie Oono, who is the Executive Director of the Content Policy and Society Lab and the co-organizer of this event. But she's also the Executive Director of the NGO Internet Without Borders and a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. So she will be able to really give us unique insights into social media content policy and transparency. Next, we will hear from Professor Nate Pursley of Stanford Law School. Professor Pursley is the co-director of the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford and has published very widely on platform regulation, as well as constitutional law and voting rights. And most recently, he's been in the news for co-authoring the Platform Transparency and Accountability Bill, a legislative proposal put forward by a group of US senators, which would really change the landscape in US law when it comes to research on social media. So we'll be hearing more about that today. Next, we'll hear from Professor Florence Gazelle, who is of Sciences Po and the University of Lorraine, and is the head of the Digital Governance and Sovereignty Chair. She's an expert on private law and has published widely on platform regulation in French and English. Then we will hear from Professor Dominique Cardon, Director of the Sciences Po Media Lab, and his colleague and co-author Emmanuel Vincent. Professor Cardon is an expert on social media and digital information ecosystems, while Emmanuel Vincent has particular expertise on climate misinformation. And they will present the findings of an exciting new study on Facebook moderation, which shows how much potential there is for more academic research when we increase access to platform data and transparency. And finally, Julie's colleague, Leila Mosh, the research project coordinator of the Content Policy and Society Lab, will shed further light on the links between academic research and policy. Thank you so much again for all of our panelists. We're very excited to hear from you. And Julie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you so much to the Chair Digital Governance at Sciences Po Paris, and of course to the director, Mr. Mathias Vicherat, for welcoming us this morning for me and evening Paris time. It's a great honor, of course, for the Content Policy and Society Lab to collaborate on this dialogue, this transatlantic dialogue. We thought maybe before getting into the details of the subject, so content policy and transparency and platforms transparency specifically, we thought it would be helpful to remind and probably define some of the terms used. And here I would like to focus on the issue of content policy. Why are we talking about content policy? If you use social media platforms, you're certainly familiar with some of the rules that apply on these spaces, whether they are community guidelines on Meta platforms or policies, Twitter policies on the other very interesting and big social media. You are familiar with those rules. Well, at the Content Policy and Society Lab, we thought it was interesting to not only focus on the enforcement of those rules, so that is to say the content moderation, which is another very important discipline, but also to interest ourselves in the creation of those rules, in the process that lead to those rules. And so we, at the Content Policy and Society Lab, we look not only at the rules before they are being written, but also we look at the rules, the way they're being written and the way they are being enforced. And when we talk about content policy, we rapidly realized that it was also extremely important to focus on another type of policy, which is more related to state regulation and focus therefore on content regulation. We are all here aware of the Digital Services Act, which is this new legislation that was recently adopted by the EU Parliament and soon will become a law applied in European states to big content platforms and other SMEs as well, including European SMEs. We think it's important to talk about regulation because internationally there is a trend of inflation of legislation when it comes to content in general, whether it's moderation or the creation of the rules themselves. And so for us, it's extremely important to talk about these also, to take into account some of the challenges that will arise from the variety of the regulations that are being adopted, and hopefully have emerged a common sense with regards to what it means today in the 21st century, and especially in this moment, what it means to fight the harms, to fight the misuses of social media and platforms and content in general. What does it mean to fight it in a way that does not affect unnecessarily and disproportionately freedoms? Freedom of expression, of course, but there are other freedoms that are at stake when we talk about regulating or policing content online. To this regard, I would like to jump to another very important concept at the Content Policy and Society Lab, which is that of multi-stakeholder. This ability to have different stakeholders with different interests, different backgrounds, whether they're companies, whether they're governments, whether they're civil society organizations, to sit together at the table, to dialogue, discuss about their challenges. We don't take enough time to talk about each other's challenges. Academia have issues accessing data. That is a problem for democracy. Civil society organizations have issues making sure that what they see, the misuses that they see, become priorities before they are a danger and before it's too late. Companies also seem to have difficulties explaining to governments that it's not that easy to take down a content in 24 hours, for instance, and to be fined for that. So we thought at the Content Policy and Society Lab that it was extremely important for these different stakeholders to sit together and discuss those challenges and also the successes. And hopefully out of that could emerge interesting solutions, interesting collaboration, and even ultimately interesting regulation and content policies themselves. I will put on my other hat here, because all of this experience stems from the work that I've been privileged to do sitting on the Facebook Meta Oversight Board, which is another institution quite new, created a few years ago, 2 years ago now. But I think having worked within this realm has reinforced my personal belief that, yes, it's important to collaborate. And secondly, it is urgent to be more transparent. And that's why I'm extremely happy that we're having this conversation today. The Oversight Board is a new body that is trying to make the company more transparent on the way it enforces its community standards, on the way Facebook and Instagram more specifically implement their content moderation. And I hope that this discussion today on focusing on transparency and specifically on data access, accountability, will help us decipher much better what is possible from a scientific perspective with the collaboration of academia, and how this work can better inform regulators and legislators around the world. So thank you so much, Professor Xell. Thank you so much, Professor Cardon, for the invitation. And of course, thank you so much to my director, Professor Nate Pursley, to whom I'm happy to pass on the floor now. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Julian. It's wonderful to have you here at Stanford. And thank you, everybody at Sciences Po, for inviting me here today. Hopefully we'll see each other live soon. My task today is to talk about my experience in dealing with the transparency efforts to open up the platforms, though I'm happy to talk about content policy and many other things in the Q&A if people are interested. I have sort of lived this issue for the last 5 or 6 years, more than most people, because I started with Gary King at Harvard this effort called Social Science 1, which was an effort to get the internet platforms to share data with outside researchers. Facebook was the primary company that we worked with. And what we learned through that effort, I think, is now informing some of these transparency efforts around the world, including the one that was mentioned before that I've been pushing in the United States, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act. I'm only going to speak for 4 minutes or so here, so please ask questions if you want more detail, but I'll just give you sort of the the bottom line. So in the effort to try to open up Facebook to outside review by academics, we confronted several problems. The principal one had to do with privacy. The effort for Social Science 1 was to get a group of academics who would serve as brokers between the company and the outside academic world to try to share data in a secure, privacy-protected way. I will say, to our credit, we did produce one of the largest social media data sets ever produced. But because of all of the sort of privacy filtering and noise that was added to the data, it has been of limited utility to researchers. But it's still, we have had 80 to 100 researchers who've worked on this. In addition, we learned that at least for the US population, there were significant errors in the data that had to be remedied later. I mention all this because it's that experience for years trying to work with Facebook to open up that then informed my view that we need to have legislation. The government has to be involved in creating a safe, privacy-protected pathway for outside research into platform data. That is what this legislation in the US, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, does. It is also, I think, what will happen as a result of sort of certain provisions in the Digital Services Act. My colleague at GW, Rebecca Tromble, is leading a working group in Europe on researcher access. And I think, as in so many things dealing with tech regulation, Europe will move first, and the United States, if we're lucky, will follow. But let me just talk a little bit about what that piece of legislation provides, and then what the kind of contours of transparency legislation might look like. The first is the part that I was most focused on, which is secure access for researchers. And I want to be clear, this only works if we do this in a privacy protected way. The issue that Social Science 1 confronted was that every time we tried to open up for more access, the lawyers inside Facebook, not without cause, given that they had paid a $5 billion fine for the Cambridge Analytica scandal, we always confronted this problem of whether there would be leakage of private data. And so we need to have a government-specified secure pathway for outside researchers to get access to platform data. There are a lot of sort of technicalities on how you do this. In my opinion, the way that we've specified it is that the data will reside at the firm, but the basic dynamic is that Facebook and Google should not have a monopoly on the data that they possess, and which is the most rich for analyzing pretty much every social problem known to man right now. And so the access that the outside researchers have to have would be comparable to that of inside researchers. And the only question, as I said, whether the only people who will analyze the data would be those who are beholden to the companies. The second part of the law, that proposal, is immunity for people who scrape publicly available data. So researchers who wish to get basically scrape data that is on Facebook shall have the be immune from civil or criminal liability for doing so. There's a famous example of what's happened at the NYU, New York University Ad Observatory related to that, and that was motivating this. The third part is a set of public transparency obligations on the platforms to publish data sets related to advertising, content moderation, and content in general, and then the ingredients to their algorithms. These would be public transparency measures to make sure that everyone will have access to some of that information, but it will be done in a way that's totally privacy protected to make sure that individual identities are not discoverable in those kind of reports. Let me just conclude by saying why it's essential, what happens when we do this. My view is that that this is not just about transparency and sort of getting a window on what's happening on the platforms, though that is, of course, quite important. When the platforms know that we have access to that data, right, it will change their behavior, right? Because just like any other institution or person that's being watched, right, they will then know that they won't be able to get away with certain things that they're able to when they can keep the data secret. This will then be better for governments because we will have better information on which to base public policy. It will be better for the companies themselves, I think, because outsiders will now be able to discover things and to devote resources to problems that even the companies themselves can't dedicate resources to. And then finally, it'll be better for the public, not only so that we will understand what is happening on these platforms and to keep the platforms accountable, but also this opens up a whole avenue of research to understand really what's happening in human society. Everything dealing with COVID disinformation, to radicalism online, to any other number of social problems. Only if we have the data will we be able to craft solutions. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. I'm not sure who I should turn it back over to. Rachel, maybe you can turn it over to someone, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Florence will comment next.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I will, for my part, I will try to build on this extremely stimulating remarks. I think that we all share this idea that transparency is absolutely essential for everyone. And since I was interested by this bill that was introduced in Congress in December, I carefully read Professor Persily's testimony before Congress, and I have to say that this morning we studied it in class with the students. They all were so interested, and I'm sure that they are watching us tonight. And I wanted to say a few words probably for the French audience, or at least to explain why, even if we can share this objective of transparency because we have common values, we are still discussing this content policy issue with probably a different perspective because the legal environment and the cultural environment is different on both sides of the Atlantic. So what I would like to highlight and what I read in Professor Persily's testimony is very interesting for a French audience, because it is said, and Professor Persily highlighted, that in the US, most direct regulation of harmful but legal online content would violate the First Amendment. And that with a few notable exceptions like child protection, the regulation of hate speech, disinformation cannot be done through outright bans or takedown mandates. So you discuss the possibility of repealing or amending Section 230 of Communications Decency Act, and you said it might expose the platforms to liability for defamation, for example, but it wouldn't solve the problem of hate speech. So it's extremely important for a French professor like me to insist on these points, especially for the students and especially the French students, because we do not always understand this debate as it is currently taking place in the US. You probably know that we live in France in a legal environment in which speech can be much more tightly regulated. We have a criminal offense of negationism in France, which is the act of denying the Holocaust. We have a criminal offense of what we call fake news. It's punishable under certain conditions. So it is easy when we're in France to conclude that it is up to the law to determine what can and cannot be said online, and that it is up to the courts as independent bodies to enforce these rules. So sometimes when you hear the French debate, it appears that the courts would be much more legitimate to define the right balance between the respect of freedom of expression on the one hand and the fight against hate speech and disinformation on the other hand. And the courts would be in a better position than the platforms, at least in this perspective. So this is the kind of ideas that you can hear sometimes here in France. I don't share those ideas. I don't think it would be realistic to ask the courts and to ask specialized judges to intervene all the time to determine if a certain content is acceptable or not. And of course, we need, to a certain extent, to trust the platforms. We know they use algorithmic curation anyway. So of course, they are the best place to do it. However, and this is where we can share this objective, it must be done in a totally transparent manner. And then we have those issues that you've been mentioning. To what extent should they be transparent? Should they be transparent to researchers? Should they be transparent to regulatory authorities? Should they be fully transparent to the public? And how is it possible to enforce this transparency obligation? We are very much concerned in France by this issue of enforcement, because we already have cases where the platforms did not disclose the information they were asked to disclose by the courts, by the French courts. It occurred a few times. So I think we still need to discuss this and to define the best solutions and the best rules to deal with this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florence. Emmanuel, would you like to present now?
Yes. Hi, everybody, and thanks for the invitation. So I'm a climate scientist by training, and I came late to the misinformation space and research, but as a climate scientist, I was directly confronted with the problem. So I want to show you a couple slides about the research I'm leading at the Media Lab in Sciences Po. Can you see my screen? Please let me know. It's now in full. Okay. So in this research, I'm going to talk about, it's really one example about the content policy we are talking about, using some of the data issues we are discussing. And I'm going to show you what Facebook is doing in what they call the repeat offender policy. So first, a very quick background. I said I'm a climate scientist. I'm also leading the Science Feedback Initiative, which is a fact-checking organization that is partnering with Facebook. And you might know that Facebook is partnering with about 80 such fact-checking organizations. And as such, we can report some URLs or posts from the platform as false or partly false or missing context. But when a URL is marked as false, this is what happens for the people who shared it or who are about to share it. They see a notification from Facebook. Now, in addition to this information, this notification, Facebook is also reducing the virality of the individual URL or the posts that shared it. So this is just a very quick verification with available data. You can count the number of likes over time and see that over the time when the fact check was issued and reported to Facebook, the rate of increase of the number of likes on this content decreased dramatically after the flag was in effect. So that's the very direct consequence of what Facebook is doing on false content reported to it. But now there is a more long-term kind of policy that Facebook is communicating about, which is about what they call the repeat offenders. So they state that the pages that repeatedly share misinformation will have their distribution reduced. So now if we want to check that, if we are talking about regulation, we need to be able to check whether they actually enforce this policy or how it's being done. So we use data for this, and the data we start with come from two origins. One is the data made available by Science Feedback through the Open Feedback platform, and the other one is the Social Science One dataset, and both have advantages. The Social Science One contains all the fact checks by all the fact checkers, but only for the most viral URLs. So we miss some of the smaller accounts. Then we use the the data available to researcher, which is CrowdTangle, that allows us to know how many interactions the posts from these accounts that share this information repeatedly get. And we rely on this policy that was stated in the press by Facebook that repeat offender status is determined by 2 strikes in 90 days period. So on this group here that I'm showing, you can see the total number of interaction, engagement on their posts over time, and shaded in red are the repeat offender period. And visually, you can see that not much is happening for this group. So now if we want to generalize this to a much bigger set of data, this is what it looks like. So for groups, you see that whether they are under supposed repeat offender or status or not, at least up until 2020, nothing happens. So this is a good basis for showing that our analysis doesn't catch anything when nothing is to be catched. But for pages, the reduction is roughly about 50%. So everything they publish after getting 2 false news is reduced in terms of visibility on the platform. And now we wanted to know what's the impact of this on the overall distribution from these accounts. So we looked at the total engagement of all their posts from these groups and pages that publish misinformation repeatedly and plot this time series here. And you can see that the time series is increasing at the time of the pandemic and decreasing sharply in June 2020. So again, I just want to illustrate what we can do with this data to understand what happened on Facebook's side. So this total engagement that I showed in the previous slide can be decomposed as the number of posts times the engagement per post. And the number of posts basically shows you that these groups and pages increase their activity during the pandemic and remain more active after that. So probably they had more time or more energy to post more information, but the engagement per post decreased drastically on June 29, 2020. So this can only be explained by something that Facebook would have done to these groups or pages on this date to drastically reduce their reach. And now it's similar to what I showed before, but just about this June drop magnitude. And it's showing you here that the groups are affected by this measure and not the pages. So to make it short, Facebook has in 2020 maybe realized that they had a problem with groups sharing a lot of misinformation. They didn't have this repeat offender policy, but they decreased all their posts virality at once in June 2020, a quick fix if you want. I mean, that's what we hypothesize. And now, after that, in 2021, so after that first study, I showed you the results, we noticed that some groups now started posting this kind of screenshot saying that they had reduced distribution. So this is a notification they get from Facebook. So this was new, right, starting in 2021. So we collected all these posts with CrowdTangle, and we are able to show that there were a few of them in July 2020. So maybe Facebook tried the policy, but not many groups were informed. And in February 2021, it really started. So many groups started complaining that they were under reduced distribution. So we could show that in 2021, groups were actually being enforced by Facebook policy against repeat offender. So this is the kind of retro engineering of the Facebook algorithm that we are able to do thanks to data from the social science one and what the fact checkers also make available, plus the CrowdTangle data. So overall, what we've seen is that the repeat offenders policy is applied. It's related to a 50% reduction for pages and websites that share repeatedly false information. And it wasn't applied on groups. And as you've seen on this time series, overall, the effect of this policy is to prevent misinformation from growing, but it's not really reducing the total amount circulating over time. And we've been also able to see that Facebook started implementing its policy on groups. So you can read more about this in the 2 papers by colleague and myself that one is published and the other one is submitted. So just a very quick talk about the data. So we use CrowdTangle data, and it's very important and crucial for the kind of research here. And we also use social science one, and it's great. The only weaknesses, some of them are that the data is not available for 2021, for instance. So we rely on old data. And it's also for only the most viral posts. So we can't know about the smaller groups. And there is also an issue about loss of data. And it's true for Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. They delete accounts. And so we lose track of the scale of the issue when we want to do a time series about what it looked like in the past, then we miss a lot of data. Okay, I'm going to let Dominique Cardon take it from here.
Just a few words, because it's a pleasure to participate to this discussion. Just to say that at the Media Lab at Sciences Po, we try to use data just in order to have a better understanding of a kind of research in social science on the changing structure of the public space. And the research conducted by Emmanuel Vincent and Héloïse Thérault is a good example of the things that we are trying to do with few data or complex data, or perhaps data that are lacking on. We need to get better data. It will be my main message. But perhaps the first thing to say is that in Europe, things will change with the new Digital Service Act. On part of the Digital Service Act, there are many different things, but one of the important things for access to data and regulation of the data is coming through the implementation of the Code of Practice on Disinformation. And this Code of Practice has been defined in April 2018 as a kind of obligation and discussion with platform in a self-regulatory way, let's say, and Facebook, Twitter, Google, Mozilla, the International Advertisement Board signed this Code of Practice. But it doesn't mean a lot for them to sign this Code of Practice, but they have to produce each year a kind of annual self-assessment report. And it's a kind of self-regulation where we ask them some commitment and ask questions, and they answer to those questions. But as it appears that it was not enough for regulators, we are in a new process, and this process will be linked to the framework of the Digital Service Act just before, which is to strengthen the Code of Practice in 2021. And by this new process, the idea is that regulators in Europe are the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services, named ERGA, and ERGA for France is the ARCOM that we call at first CSA, and they could have access. We still don't know how the process will be implemented, in fact, but they could have access to data coming from the platform for a kind of regulatory process in which they could have a clear supervision of the things that platform only answer through their self-assessment report. That's the reason why we are interested by this discussion on the new legal framework. On next slide, Emmanuel, it's also done through a large network of actors that have been launched by the European Commission around the European Digital Media Observatory. And in many countries in Europe and in France, we are leading at Sciences Po the consortium de facto with Sciences Po AFP, which is a very important press agency, and the CREMI for media education, try to have this kind of interdisciplinary network of researchers, journalists, and educators, just in order to have new insight about this information process, but more than just fact checks, trying to see what are the new balance and things that is happening in the digital media ecosystem, let's say. And that's the reason why we need so strongly to have access to data. Next slide, but perhaps just to say a very, very short few words, but it's closely linked to what Persily said at first, that how do we produce research. We use many different strategies because it's quite complex. We don't have the good data set for the things that we want to do, and I think that we want to do as a researcher, but also the things that the new regulatory process of the code of conduct needs for this kind of oversight, supervision of the policy of digital platforms. So for having a kind of picture of media, of articles, we scrap data. In fact, that's the only way to do that on website. For Twitter, we have the API, so it's quite correct because we could have access to Twitter, but Twitter is not very representative of what is circulating on the French digital ecosystem. And for Facebook, we have, because we are part, thanks to Ned, Persily, and Gary King, we have access to Social Science One and Condor dataset. We use Condor dataset, but it's not, we have difficulties, perhaps we could discuss that. But Emmanuel mentioned those kind of problems that we could have with the interpretation of the differential privacy noise inside the dataset. And sometimes the best tools is to use quadrangle just to get the data. And we know that quadrangle, we still don't know if Facebook will still support quadrangle, and it's becoming for us now the main tools in order to do that. So perhaps I will just end the presentation here, but part of the discussion that we have, part of the question we have is to know if we have to work independently, if we have to work with the new regulatory framework of the code of conduct with the ARCOM and ERGA and regulatory bodies that appears in France, and we'll have more resource in the future with the Digital Service Act, or if we have to work with platforms as we are doing with Facebook, but thanks to Social Science One, we have access to Facebook, but we don't have access to YouTube, for example. And for content moderation, part of our work is on YouTube, but we don't have a specific access to those data. So thank you. I will just stop here, and I'm waiting for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights into your work. Leila, would you like to finish?
Hi, hello. Yes, thank you all for this very, very interesting discussion. And I'm so happy we can share this transatlantic bridge between Sciences Po and Stanford. Maybe to sum up and to kind of like opening the discussion, I completely agree with Julie when she said that the multi-stakeholder discussion is much needed, because as we saw with GDPR, what kind of regulation Europe can create does have an impact on the rest of the world. It's not just about Europe, and the kind of regulation the US can create does also have an impact on the rest of the world. So I do agree on how it's important that both Europe and the United States share a common discussion about these challenges that we face alongside our two countries, our two big countries, even if, as Florence said, we have a lot of cultural differences, especially from the First Amendment. But what I would also like to add, and we had a workshop about that a few days ago with the Content Policy and Society Lab, it's also about what Asian country could add to the discussion, and what Russia could add to the discussion, and what African country could add to the discussion, because the kind of regulation we could put in act will have an influence way broader. So that's the first thing I would like to add, and I'm very grateful that the Content Policy and Society Lab is trying to assess these differences among our territories. I'd like to add a point about the link between researchers and policy and the value of transparency from the perspective. What we kind of like feel and fear with the Content Policy and Society Lab is a trench war of truth that could be now taking place between public opinion and experts and the political class on one side, and big tech platforms on the other side, and each of them accusing of all the kind of scandals and all of the evils of our society. And one side claim the innocence, but we don't have any kind of proof, so to dig into, to actually understand what's happening. And on the other side, we may actually give false accusation to this platform. And I think this war of truth could be avoided if we actually cared more about the discussion that could happen between public policies, agencies, and the high civil society, and the research and academic field. For example, in France, only 10% of PhD go into the civil services. In the end, and if we take Germany as an example, we have 7 times fewer doctoral students in the senior administration than in Germany. And French public decision makers are therefore more distant from the world of research, and sometimes place less values on the scientific approach in the broad sense that German could do, or than the people in the United States could do. And the fact that Nathaniel Persily is the author of a law actually in the Senate is kind of a proof of how maybe closer are the world of researchers and political makers in the United States. I think it's very important because the small number of senior civil servants capable of understanding and synthesizing the most recent research in the immediate environment of politicians can actually lead to later to rely on outdated or fragmented information, or even to draw false conclusions. And if we take the example of the role of Cambridge Analytica's manipulation on social media platform, Facebook in the vote for Brexit, we shouldn't have this kind of debate or that still is going on like years after that, where we still don't know what happened and we still claim things sometimes, and we still kind of like in a blurry environment about that. It's very important that we kind of like try to find the truth about that, and we give researchers the capabilities to go in that way. So it's really important that discussion between researchers from different backgrounds take place, and the discussion we're having right now should resonate way broader than just Sciences Po and just Stanford, because this is kind of, we are dealing with personal life issues, and we're dealing with the kind of future we're going to give to the next generation. So conscious incompetence, which is a specialty of researcher, is key to understand and try to assess the complex challenges our society are facing. So maybe to sum up, from Paris to Brussels to Stanford to New York, especially at such an important time as the French presidency of the European Union, and with the approach of crucial election for France, but also the law that Nathaniel is leading in the Senate, we must encourage our representatives to turn their eyes to what researchers are saying and integrate them as much as possible into the decision-making process. Today's discussion proves it. Regulating digital technology, framing freedom of expression, promoting transparency requires answering questions of almost limitless complexity. So if I can sum up in that discussion, I would love that we try to, each of us and that civil representative, care more and to create bolder and stronger links between the research world and the political world. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Leila, and to all of our speakers. That was really interesting, and we still have just over half an hour for questions, which is great. So we already have some, both here and on YouTube, but in the interest of time, to get through as many as possible, it would be great if you could all just send your questions by text, and I will read them out for the panelists. There's a Q&A function at the bottom menu in Zoom. So you can type your question there, and you can also upvote other questions that you think are particularly interesting. And we'll try and get to as many as possible. So first up for the whole panel, we have a question from Guillaume Guinard, who asks whether it would be possible to overcome First Amendment related issues by setting rules that regard the level of propagation of content instead of setting rules on content censorship.
So that's a good question, and it also allows me to respond a little bit to Florence's point about the First Amendment. I'll deal with that question directly in a second. But while it is true that in the U.S. we have a very libertarian free speech tradition that prevents us from regulating content, a lot of the most objectionable content directly, I have not seen around the world any government step up to the task of regulating content. No one has done it successfully. At least in the areas that we care about, let's say incitement, hate speech, disinformation that causes offline harm. So whether you look at the online harms bill that's in Britain, or the NetzDG law that is in Germany, or India's efforts to clamp down in their country, or Singapore, you go down the line, no one has successfully really gotten at these problems. And so that while there's a constitutional problem in the US, part of the problem here is the technology. And this is, I think, goes back to what Florence was saying, which is that you've got, when I give my speeches on content policy, I talk about velocity, virality, and volume, right? The speed at which information travels, the fact that it's done through peer-to-peer transfer, as opposed to sort of broadcast in the traditional form, and the sheer amount of information and communication that we all have on our cell phone, right? It's a totally different speech environment, and the law is simply not able to play catch up in the way that is necessary here. Now, that is not to say we shouldn't have greater regulation, and we should have, I think, a lot of experimentation here with different legal regimes to see what might work. But it takes something like climate denialism that Emmanuel was talking about, and to craft a law that would actually get at, say, misinformation with respect to climate, let alone something like COVID and the like. It's extremely difficult. That's one of the reasons I sort of put my money where my mouth is with this law that I've put out. It's extremely difficult to write legislation and regulation in this area. Now, let me just talk about the directly on the question of what the First Amendment prevents and what it doesn't. So direct regulations of disinformation and hate speech are unconstitutional in the United States, right? We simply can't do that. There's some types of disinformation that might be possible, but most disinformation is not regulable. You can establish what are known as time, place, and manner regulations, right? So you could possibly regulate virality directly. You could regulate, the policies that the platforms have adopted. You can hold the platforms perhaps to their own promises. That is one of the things that Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, is doing in her lawsuits or her actions with the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, is to say that Facebook is essentially deceiving its investors and others, and because it is saying that it's doing one thing while it is actually doing another. So there are other ways to get at it, but generally speaking, you're not regulating the content, specific types of content. You're regulating the technology. You're regulating the time, place, and manner of speech.
Can I rapidly on this? I would like to wholeheartedly agree with what Professor Pursley, what Nate has just said, and invite us all to focus not only on the content itself, because we have seen it's very difficult. It puts us in difficult situations. The example mentioned prove it, and an example like India is a proof of where that focus on content can actually lead to more censorship, to more effects against freedom of expression. And tying this to a broader discussion on, yes, it is possible to fight the harms by focusing on the processes, by focusing on the principles, the safeguards that we put in that limitation of harms, rather than focusing on the content itself. So just wanted to insist that I hope one of the things that can come of this discussion is the type of principle that should guide data access, including when we're talking about data, we're also talking about, people, individuals, although of course the right to privacy is the most important value here to keep in mind. But very soon we're going to have a discussion on, I don't want my data to be used by researchers in XYZ country, for instance. Are we going to get to that point? In our workshop last week, for instance, one of our participants was saying how we're going to make sure that those data are actually and protecting, safeguarding privacy, how we're going to make sure that those data are not data of Europeans. Will we ask to show the passport of the said data? I mean, these are very interesting and challenging questions that speaks to the importance of focusing on the processes and the safeguards rather than focusing on the content and the data itself. Thank you.
Can I just add a word? Because sometimes we are strengthening the differences between the US and European law, and I'm not sure, for sure there are two different traditions, but It's also difficult in the European law to have more restriction on freedom of speech. And in fact, we have a very specific set of law everywhere in the world, except in the US for hate speech. But for disinformation, it's also a very few exceptions on every legislators in Europe that try to reinforce the idea of disinformation. It was not possible because of the principle of law. So we are also very strongly attached to the idea that it's about the process, it's about virality, it's about the accountability of algorithmic amplification that the regulation should address at first, in fact, in all those questions. Perhaps we try to have a too strong opposition between the two regulatory systems, but Florence knows that more than me.
Yeah, thanks so much. Does anyone else want to comment on this? Okay, so in that case, maybe we can go to the next question. From Mark Dempsey in the chat, Mark asks, the question remains, to what extent can platforms be trusted? Regulation has become urgent because it has become clear that they cannot be trusted. How can we get around that?
I'm happy to jump in if you want, but is there someone else? So let me say that look, we are turning to the platforms to do the work that both civil society and governments have done in the past, right? I think we should, be honest that this is not, a lot of these content moderation problems, whether you're dealing with disinformation, whether you're dealing with hate speech and the like, first of all, as a total amount of speech that occurs on the platforms, it's actually a small share, right? Because most of what people go to Facebook for is to see cat videos and to hear about their families and things like that. And so as a share of the total amount of communication, it's actually a small amount. Now, look, just because it's a small amount, you're still talking about billions of pieces of content, right? Because there's so much that is online in these platforms. But the challenge is that because the technology is changing so quickly, because there are so many problems that they are confronting, they are sort of throwing up their hands and saying, "Look, here's the way we're trying to solve this problem. If you've got a better solution, come up with it." And now I don't have any sympathy for that position because look, they're trillion-dollar companies, and so they have unleashed this on the world, and so they are responsible for it. But that's why Facebook, at least I think, does deserve some credit for establishing something like the Oversight Board as an opportunity to try to, in a sense, democratize the content moderation problem. And so the point that the questioner makes about not trusting the platforms, that is exactly why we need to focus on transparency, right? It's not about delivering a private good to pointy-headed researchers like myself. It's about opening up the platforms to scrutiny from the outside so that these decisions cannot be made in secret, and so that we have a better insight as to what is actually going on the platforms. We'll know more about how their policies are affecting the information environment, and we'll know more about the information environment itself, right? So that we'll have a sense of the scale of these problems like disinformation, hate speech, and incitement.
Perhaps just to, it's not an answer, but a question to Nathaniel Persily, but because as we need to have more accountable platform with transparency and to see the process, that's so important for now. I think we can't trust the platform so quickly for sure. But my understanding, and that part of the question that I have in mind always, that is it possible to create this kind of specific area or space where regulators and researchers could access to the data because they are linked to another constraint on privacy law? But could it be the best solution in order to have this kind of democratic assessment and transparency for the public? They could say that researchers and regulators are part of the problem and not of the solution in this kind of new arrangement. But we trying to use data in many different ways we come to the conclusion that we need to create this kind of very specific space, but how can we be legitimate to have access to those data and to say to the public that it's good, it's the assessment of platform procedure is quite correct and things like that. We also need to have a public confidence in this situation. How do you see this kind of problem?
Good. So there's several levels to that question. The first is what kind of transparency is necessary. The second is how can we actually trust data that's provided by these platforms. The first point, this is something we try to deal with in the legislation, which is the way you can think about it is that the information that the platform possesses should be made as widely available, consistent with individual privacy, right? So that there are certain reports, and they do this already, like their takedown reports, like how many accounts they've taken down for hate speech violations and the like, right? At a high level of generality. And so there should be more transparency to the public on those dimensions. So that's one thing. The second, and CrowdTangle and like the ad archives that they produced, I think are examples of how you can have transparency that doesn't really infringe on privacy. Where things get sensitive, right, is in the privacy, sort of the individual level data that the researchers inside the firms have access to, and that we tried for many years with Social Science One to get access to. The way that I envision this working is the way that we do this with certain other kinds of sensitive data in the US, where the data would still reside at the firm, but then outsiders would be able to come in and have the same access that the internal researchers would. They would not, however, be able to take the data outside of that environment. That's key to all of this working. And there would be criminal penalties on the researchers if they tried to repeat another Cambridge Analytica, right? So the researchers and the universities they're affiliated with have to be invested in this. Now, but that doesn't answer your antecedent question, which is, well, what happens if they give crappy data to the researchers, right? Which is something we have experienced with Social Science One. And the answer, at least in the law that we proposed, is that this is where the multi-billion-dollar fines would come in. This is because then the enforcement agency that's given oversight in the US, the Federal Trade Commission, is the same one that basically enforced the Cambridge Analytica settlement, as well as all kinds of other antitrust, pro-competition regulations and enforcement against fraud. And so if there are several other provisions here that would require Facebook to reveal, or other firms, to reveal the data sets and the structure of the data sets that they themselves are analyzing. And then if they turn over, essentially they lie to researchers and give over false data sets, then they would be on the hook for massive penalties, right? And so, look, there's still the possibility that they're going to screw up, and we got to assume that there's going to be, some, learning process here. But I think that this is about as good as you can do without just taking someone from the government and basically sticking them inside the firm.
Okay, thanks so much. If there aren't any other comments on that, I'll go to the next question. There's one for you, Julie. You talked about the importance of engaging multiple stakeholders. Could you please share some insights on how the Oversight Board, Meta, and Facebook in general engage with stakeholders around content governance?
Oh, thank you so much for this question. I can't speak for Meta, so I'll focus only on the work that we do at the Oversight Board, and that we're also trying to replicate within the Content Policy and Society Lab and working with different partners. So the board, as you know, makes binding decisions based on appeals that are sent to us by users or by the company itself on enforcing its own rules. And before we get to our final decision, there are several opportunities to engage with the board. So through public comments, usually when we publish a new case, we invite people from anywhere around the world who feel concerned by the issue at stake, and usually the community standard at stake and the question and the challenge posed by that community standard can contribute in the form of, written submission to the work and informing the decision of the Oversight Board. We've received reports contributions from organizations, but also from individuals. And on top of that, the board also makes recommendations to the company through what we call policy advisory opinions. We have one ongoing policy advisory opinion on the cross-check program, which you probably have heard about, and which could be a very interesting case study for this discussion today. For these policy advisory opinions, we of course welcome public comments, but we also do roundtables with different stakeholders, whether they are universities, academics, or also organizations, and we commission as well research for those who on very specific issues with regards to the policy advisory that we will publish. So there are different ways to engage with different stakeholders, and yes, I think it's very important to better inform, of course, our work, of course, at the board, but also in general regulation and policy that can come out of it. Yes, that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, great, thank you. And then, so I think in regard to the Platform Transparency and Accountability Act, or to similar proposals, someone has asked, if companies don't want that data being accessed, can't they just move it to a different country in which they have protection?
No. Because I mean, that again is why the penalties would be there, right? You can't just sort of say, well, hey, now we don't have it anymore. And again, the philosophy here behind this kind of regulation, and I hope I'm not repeating myself too much here, is that they have the data already. The only question is whether the employees of the firms are the only people who should have access to it, right? We're not asking them to create new data. It's like they have, they do all kinds of research inside these firms, but those data scientists at the companies should not be the only ones who have access to it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for clarifying. And then more for Emmanuel and maybe Dominique. Does your research suggest any negative side effects of Facebook's effort to stop the spread of misinformation? For example, stopping the spread of legitimate information?
Not that I've been aware of. I don't think it ever happened as a direct consequence of what Facebook is doing, for instance, like to block some piece of information that is actually accurate. I think there are sometimes some bugs, and it happens on all the platforms where it happened once recently where they blocked some accounts from a scientific journal because probably somebody flagged it for the wrong reasons. But yeah, it doesn't happen otherwise. What I can say the rest of outside of this misinformation policy is that there is no really effort to promote reliable information. At least there is an effort, but the result is not huge in terms of really changing the ecosystem of information on Facebook. So there is something about really the algorithm, the recommendation algorithm, and what is being used to maximize engagement or money or whatever they use to tune their algorithm. So it's true that for this, I think the policy is not really tuning the algorithm to increase the visibility of accurate content. So to make it short, basically the Facebook policy, they focus on false information, and somehow they decrease it to some extent. There is no counterweight to that to try to really identify the most trusted source of information and promote that to help readers have access to accurate information.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. Does anyone else want to comment on that? Julie?
I would rapidly like to speak to one aspect that we've touched upon here, but I think we could probably push a bit further, which is the international aspect of disinformation, and how it relates to the question that was just asked to Emmanuel on the potential side effects. I think even for researchers and I'm speaking here from experience, we've done research ourselves as organizations, not before I was affiliated with any academic institution. And it is true that our work can lead to potentially very serious side effects, including silencing very necessary voices, which otherwise somehow find themselves in the midst of coordinated or fake content and fake engagement and all this inauthentic behavior that can be observed on social media platforms, and specifically Facebook here. I'm talking about Facebook. And what we realize is how important it is also to confront the data, the analysis, when it's possible, of course, with organizations and experts who have been working on the ground. I think this is even more important when we talk about the importance of taking into account context when it comes to content and when it comes to content moderation. And that context can also be informed by increased dialogue between the researchers and the objective data they have, confronting them with also the work and the reality of organizations working on different countries and in different contexts. I think this is something that I hope to see more, because we don't have best practices yet. I mean, I haven't seen such, and I would like to see more of these being addressed. Thank you.
Perhaps just about, but just to make a link between, we doesn't pick about more about content moderation and the public access to content moderation policy, because we have the kind of annual report that they publish, but for researcher, but I'm not sure that we need, because it could have side effects, publication of database of each items that they take down sometimes. That's part of the research that we are doing. But for this reason, I have a question for Julie, because with the oversight board, Facebook oversight board, we speak a lot about Facebook, but not about the other platforms. And do you have discussion inside the oversight board about the fact that you could be the kind of oversight board for other platforms too? Or is it so closely linked to Facebook that you couldn't be this kind of multi-stakeholder, but combining and aggregating claims coming from different platforms?
Thank you very much, Dominique, for this question. So there are no discussions of such, at least that I'm aware of at the Oversight Board, but rather what we see is that the work that we do does inform the industry. Can't lie about that. The very good example is, of course, the most famous case that we've ever had to deal with at this stage, which was that of the former president of the United States, but also more broadly on how politicians and public figures should be treated by platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. And so I think that it's an interesting value to be harnessed. There could be learnings and also sharings between different initiatives around self-regulation and specifically on content. Informing each other's work could be a very interesting way to go about this. But there are no discussions that I'm aware of on expanding to other companies.
I can say something about this, which is that the corporate structure of the Oversight Board actually allows for other platforms to become part of it. And so the trust documents, now I'm speaking really as a lawyer here, the trust documents are such that it contemplates the possibility that the Oversight Board would have sort of jurisdiction beyond just Facebook. But my experience in Silicon Valley is that the other platforms are just sort of waiting to see what would happen here. And it's possible that, originally when we were working on this issue at Stanford, we had tried to come up with a kind of model on the Motion Picture Association, right? Like we do for movies and the like in the US. But obviously content moderation is such a gigantic issue, and because it's international, it poses unique problems. Also, my colleague Evelyn Dueck has written about the dangers of content cartels. Like, should the same rules apply to Facebook that would apply to YouTube, that would apply to Twitter, let alone small platforms like Pinterest, Reddit, and the like? And so, but I think the structure is there. And so if there's the possibility that other platforms, particularly smaller ones, wanted to make use of the oversight board, that's contemplated in the legal documents that created it.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. Ahil has also asked, I think, yeah, in relation to misinformation content policy, would a hardware ban of sorts prevent admin systems from making new accounts to evade their reduced reach and continue their misinformation posting?
Sorry, I didn't hear part of the question. Can you please repeat?
Sorry, the question is, when people have their reach reduced because they've been, I guess, getting a double strike, for example, posting misinformation, would a hardware ban of some kind prevent them from making new accounts to evade these measures?
Oh, I can answer to that. I mean, when Facebook, for instance, decreases the reach of an account for sharing repeatedly misinformation, they do not intend to have this account disappear. They really don't. I think the rationale behind it is that giving a little strike like this for 90 days, it's kind of an encouragement for this account to stop spreading misinformation. I mean, that's, I think, the spirit behind the rule, which I don't think works, because what we see is that accounts that spread misinformation yesterday are the ones that spread misinformation today. They just keep doing it. But sometimes they learn to play around the rules. So when it comes to taking accounts down completely, that's usually a different policy. It's not misinformation, or it's very harmful misinformation or hate speech. That's really what triggers a ban. And I think on this front, all these platforms take down billions of accounts every year. At least that's what Facebook is saying. So they are already doing that, at least trying to catch all these accounts that spread harmful content and banning them. But the implementation is hard. I mean, detecting, it's easy to create a new account, a new email address from a new IP, and just, you're fresh for the platform. They don't know you.
Can I rapidly pick up on this to link it to another issue that was mentioned briefly, I think, by Nate or Dominique, sorry, I can't remember. But the issue of the level of transparency that we can obtain and that we should obtain, bearing in mind also adversarial uses of that transparency, and the fact that bad actors may be more enforced to game the system. So I mean, I was hoping maybe Nate or Dominique or Florence, if there's been any thinking around this, but because this is, I think, probably one of the aspects that makes it difficult to achieve some level of transparency. So yeah, just was curious to know what's your position on adversarial uses of transparency and the level of transparency we're looking at.
Yes, well, that's one of the reasons why, at least when I originally proposed the legislation, I was limiting it to academic researchers as opposed to like just anybody who wants to have access. And I am concerned as we make changes to that proposal, there's a big push to say that it shouldn't just be academic researchers, that you should have, journalists and others, but it's very hard to define what a journalist is, right? Or a think tank. And so the whole idea behind sort of limiting it to academic institutions was that we kind of know what a university is, and we can nest the researchers in legal relationships with their employers, whereas with think tanks and journalists, much more difficult. So that's responsive to your question in the following way, which is that you have to be careful in what data is made publicly available so that both other firms and bad actors would have access to it. And so I think it's reasonable for the companies not to, make it, public about how they're dealing with every bad actor, right, on the platform and what the measures are that they're taking. But that can be done consistent with user privacy, and we can get certain kinds of information from them. Apropos that, I mean, what might be interesting to Emmanuel based on the research that he produced, here's an example of something that Facebook did. Facebook during the 2020 election campaign in the US, which overlaps the time period that you're studying, stopped recommending political group pages in the US, right? So that's going to have and we know that had a huge effect on the popularity, not just of like campaign pages, but also all political groups. So that may have also affected some of the data on climate change and the other things that you're talking about. And so it is whenever you have some kinds of insights that are produced about enforcement actions, it's going to lead to some kind of gamesmanship. But I think that can be done consistent with the sort of transparency obligations that we're trying to foist on these platforms.
If I can just quickly have a comment on this. During the 2020 election, we saw a lot of things happening on Facebook that I didn't talk about here. Most notably, what we saw is they made disappear like a huge amount of groups related to QAnon. So that was a huge drop also in the data, and it all just disappeared, vanished from the platform. So that's one issue where we would like to have access to what has been deleted, because otherwise we can't study time evolution about things happening. And we could also have a look at the recommendation of groups in the sense maybe of how many followers, new followers they gain over time. Another experimentation that Facebook did around the election for 2 months, they turned the button on, whatever that they did at the algorithm, to promote more reliable sources. So during the time of the election and for 2 months, they kind of did that, promote more reliable sources. And it really decreased the amount of misinformation circulating. But after 2 months, they just turned it off and went back to the normal, the pre-enforcement policies, maybe because it led to fewer engagement. So that's really the kind of thing that I was mentioning before, that the incentives of the platform, if it's to make money and maximize engagement, then whatever policy that goes against that is not going to really be enforced, because it goes against the core business model of the platform. So that's where transparency is needed, so that there is another incentive to do something to improve the situation.
Okay, amazing, thanks. We're kind of coming up to the finish time, but if everyone has time, I might ask one last question. If everyone's able to do that. Okay, so someone has asked, what do you think about efforts to involve users in content policymaking? So for example, apparently Twitter sometimes does user surveys, but could that kind of thing be expanded?
We actually have a study that we've produced with NYU on what we call crowdsourced fact checking. This was a very expensive study that we've done, and anyone should just email me if you, we've got 3 papers coming out. And the basic idea here, we were trying to test the ability of individual people to do fact checking in real time, because the fact checking network is not, it doesn't scale well and it doesn't work in a lot of ways. And so if you could get average people to do it, we wanted to see how good people were, and they're not very good. is the bottom line. Certainly you have a lot of, the survey stuff that has some utility, but that's usually for all kinds of other procedures for the platforms. Of course, the users are involved in content moderation because they are often the first line of defense in reporting problematic content, and so then that gets flagged for the platforms and then triggers their content moderation systems in a lot of settings.
If I may rapidly add to this, of course, it would be important for us to know as users how our feedback is being used, and we don't have much of that feedback on the part of the companies. That's one criticism that I could add to, well, this inflation of relying on the users increasingly. And the second aspect is, of course, scaling. Scaling not only in the United States, but globally. We know that there is a disproportion in the means that are dedicated to fighting harmful content in big platforms, and actually the biggest one through revelations that have been made by whistleblowers. So are we going to scale those same efforts the same way in every part of the world? Are we going to to give all the credit necessary to reports and surveys and whatever else that comes from users that are not located in the United States and in Europe, and that report on harms that are not located in those two markets, that's a very important question to ask. And I haven't seen any responses yet, at least from the part of the companies.
Just to say that it's also a research ideas for research project that we have at the Media Lab, and it's quite important because as sociologists, for most of us, we try to explore self-governance in new digital speech spaces, in fact. And in fact, there are a lot of things that we can do. It could be decentralized network, but it could also be, let's say that just a Facebook group or pages is something that is regulated by moderators, because they could define some rules for people who are sharing information on this specific page or this specific group. And I think that part of the regulation could be also to enforce, to oblige in certain way platform to have to give users more tools just in order to self-regulate their speech spaces. And there are very few design things that we could do. Let's just take the example of the Twitter recommendation that before sharing this link, did you read this article? But we know that just this kind of very, very small thing inside the activity of user could have some effect. And the fact that you define the role of the publication inside the group, that you give user more tools just in order to have a specific design for their speech spaces could be good ideas for more open, plural, democratic public spaces.
If I could add one point, I remember that in the past, Facebook used to organize surveys and what they call referenda, and you had at the time very few users that decided to participate, and it was like 10 years ago. So they did decide to not to do it again. They gave up. Which is probably a pity, but apparently involving users doesn't work well, at least in this way. But yes, so Dominique mentioned decentralization, and I think that we should probably have more research about what decentralization could offer, what we call the Web3. Because it could be a way to empower users. I saw that Twitter claims that decentralization would make regulation unnecessary. So I'm not sure of it, but I suppose that we need to investigate this possibility.
And if I can step in just to wrap up, because I know we're late on the end, I think this question of decentralization is kind of a huge question, and we have a real lack of research about that, especially on the question of the blockchain. As I was saying on the comments on the YouTube live, yeah, using blockchain is costly, especially to share data, but it also depends on the kind of blockchain. And I feel like because of the crypto money situation, the blockchain as a tool has been kind of excluded of all the research, of a big part of the research we're doing today. And I think this would be very interesting, especially since Sciences Po has a partnership with the Marquardt Institute that is working on the blockchain question, to actually go deeper around that, around the Web3, and how as they say, decentralization could not really maybe make regulation needless, but maybe work with regulation to go by design on the protection of the private life, and at the same time sharing data. That could be something to deep into, and yeah, I think that would be interesting for Sciences Po and for us to have a look into that.
Okay, so yeah, sorry to go over time slightly with that last contribution. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for sharing your insights in this conversation. It's been really, really informative. I'm really sorry to anyone who asked a question and we didn't have time, but yeah, thanks so much to the audience as well for all of your questions and comments.